district attorney made the decision that we will charge this officer and the family of Dante Wright will get to have their day in court.
With the news of the decision to charge the former Brooklyn Center police officer with manslaughter comes a prolonged period of continued grieving.
The system, it needs to be changed. One, it was based on racism in the first place. And so once people understand that and know that we need a different form of policing, that is when real change happens.
And you have to keep people safe. You have to keep people safe. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, it's just, the level of attacks that are going at us, going after our qualified immunity, going after our due process rights. It's a complete assault on the people who are paid to protect the citizens.
This is not a perfect bill, but for me, as a black man, as the father of 2 sons, friends of many other black men, neighbors, etc., I think it's a good first step towards having police understand the kind of accountability that the public wants.
Also, Mayor Kim Janey is calling for more police accountability and transparency in the city.
I understand that the fabric of trust between the Boston Police Department and Boston residents has worn thin in parts of our city.
Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country.
All right, welcome to Common Narrative. And just to give you all a primer as to what we do here, Common Narrative explores and examines the media's effect on public perception across all lines of engagement and across all lines of diversity. And we're talking about civic engagement. We're talking about how you access your rights, your civil and your social rights. And today, we really wanted to dig in about police and prison reform. There's been some new data that has been come out, and also the protests that have restarted in the wake of the death of so many unarmed black men. And so this is a conversation that continues. Also, where are we now that we have signed a bill for police reform? What does that look like? So my guest here today, right here online, is Representative Chynah Tyler and Leon Smith, the Executive Director for Citizens for Juvenile Justice. I believe it's Executive Director. So that's correct. You all, and my first question, though, is where do you think we are when we're talking about police reform in the state of Massachusetts? And I want to start with Representative Tyler.
Yes, so good now afternoon. It's 12 o'clock. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me, and I'm very, very proud of the start of your vision of this show, and I look forward to continuing to participate. And where we are today is far away from where we need to be, but we're definitely going in the right direction, just even having this conversation. I'm Chynah Tyler, the representative of the 7th Suffolk District, which is big parts of Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, Fenway, South End. And I have a huge Black community. I'm an African-American woman. I come from an African-American family, 10 generations here in Boston. My mother raised 5 Black boys on her own, and then had me. So where we're at today is that we, again, far from where we need to be, but we have people in place like myself, and to be able to help us get in the right direction. Where we need to be going as far as setting the tone on direction is focusing on protecting and serving. I mean, we're talking about police reform, and that's the essential piece of their job, is to be able to protect and serve. And unfortunately, people that look like us don't feel protected and served. And so when we talk about direction, that's what we need to go, is making sure that all folks feel protected and served, not just select few.
Yes, good afternoon, Crystal. And again, thank you as well for having me on today. I think last year represented a first step in a very long road towards greater police accountability, but we indeed do have a long way to go. One thing that as Citizens for Juvenile Justice, we were happy about is that there were elements of the policing bill that pose some specific concrete steps to address the impact of overzealous and biased policing on our young people. We cannot leave our young people out of this conversation of the impact and the harm that harsh and quite frankly that police brutality has on young people. We know from research that when young people have these intrusive encounters and these negative encounters with law enforcement, they actually experience higher levels of anxiety and trauma, up to and including post-traumatic stress disorder. So it was important that even within the broader umbrella of police accountability, that you have provisions, for example, that address the damaging presence of police officers in school and how it impacts, has a negative impact on school climate, that we're addressing, stop and frisk and the impact that it has on young people, and really in some ways on their ongoing arc. So as we have these ongoing conversations, and really as when we think about policing, we have to really reimagine how we see public safety. We can no longer go with this idea that police are the one size fits all, end all, be all solution to every issue of public safety. We have to really think broader around substance abuse and mental health and supports and services, but we have to make sure we take specific effects to address how these things impact our youth.
Yeah, and I want to ask you both, as we follow the Chauvin trial, and then of course Mr. Wright's death. As folks who are in positions that work in these spaces, right? You help give information, you help guide people through language. As a journalist, I struggle to watch the coverage, though I'm supposed to. Where do you think folks are at that are in this work, in this police reform work, but also as Black and brown folks experiencing all of this?
I can comment on that. That's something that's near and dear to me. As of late, as a Black elected, as chairwoman of the Black and Latino Caucus, I feel very, very heavy in having to legislate and having to, provide solutions, which we did last year through a really, really huge police reform bill, but then also to having to be responsible to my constituency in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I would definitely say feeling very heavy in a place of passion. And sometimes it's a very not positive space or a bright space to be in, because then you're one of very few in a space of predominantly folks that aren't Black and brown. And so sometimes when you're really going through something that's very, very heavy, but then you have to also explain, how you're feeling. Sometimes these things are, and I could just say for myself, it's unexplainable. We've been dealing with this, some of us, our entire lives, all of us, our entire lives, and it's just unexplainable. And so very, very heavy, I would say, but also too, very supported in knowing that you have the ability to be able to file a bill. You have the ability to be able to put financial resources behind whatever it is that you would like to see different. And so one thing that I hope to be able to bring to light is focusing on how we can have a better relationship between our youth, such as Leon noted, and our local authority. I remember when I was young, I always saw officers, it depended on what the situation was, either a positive or a negative light. But I noticed that in times today, we don't have very many positive opportunities for youth to be able to engage with officers on a positive note. And you have a lot of officers out there that are from this community, that are from the communities in which they serve, that want to do a lot of positive things. For example, Sergeant Crispin, which was on your introduction coming into the show, and now Jeff and so many other great individuals who are, Black and brown people who are from Boston that want to be able to do well. And so we're talking about police reform and just where we're going. And you have to also remember too, we also have Black and brown officers that are actually from this community as well. And so we want to definitely make sure we do whatever we can to make sure that our youth have a positive interaction when it comes to authority, so that in the future, they're not seen as a threat. It's, hey, I know this child, or I know Chynah, or I know Leon, I know Crystal, and they're not seen as a threat. The problem becomes when you have officers that are not from this community and don't have a relationship with the people in the community. That's where the intersection of bad apples begins to happen, and we're doing everything we can to address that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and It really is. Every time there's a video of a Black life being taken in these circumstances, it's a scab is ripped off. It's traumatic, and it's been mentally, emotionally, and spiritually exhausting because it keeps happening again and again. When I look at this, pushing and fighting and advocating as I've been. This is the 20th year I've been into my career, and I've been working on this a long time, but my parents advocated on these issues. My grandparents advocated on these issues, and it keeps and continues to happen. And I'm not just here as a Black lawyer or an advocate. I'm here as a Black father, and I have a son who's coming of age. And these issues terrify me as to what he can experience. So, you're in your role as an advocate, but you have all those extra layers of concern. You have the trauma, you have the frustration of us being generations and generations into this same ongoing battle, pushing this boulder up this hill. So in so many ways, it's trying to take all of that trauma and emotion and channel it into productive action to try to bring about change, and just, trying and feeling supported. One of the things that's really come clear for me this year, CFJJ, we work in coalition with organizations across the Commonwealth, and being able to work with other amazing advocates in each of the four corners of this state that need to feel supported, to feel like you're not alone, to be able to share and unpack those frustrations, just to be able to pick up and keep going. You can't pour from an empty vessel. So it's important for us to always, in the advocacy world, in whatever capacity we work, to take that time to check in on each other, because it's hard and it never gets easier. And I'm very thankful to have been able to connect with such a robust advocacy community here in Massachusetts, which makes this fight just a little bit easier to undertake.
Absolutely. And I want to get to the state's police reform bill, but first I want to play a little bit of sound because Leon, I'd like you to dig into this report that came out this week.
Sure.
According to the report, Black people were nearly 13 times more likely to be subject of a police report than their white counterparts. The report found a small number of officers were doing the majority of the police stops. New Bedford Mayor John Mitchell released a statement saying, quote, "Although the report has not been shared with my office and I am not familiar with the organization that authored it, its findings, as we understand them, warrant our attention."
Leon, first I want you to break down the findings of this report, insofar as this space allows. But also, what really struck me was that statement from the mayor's office. It was non-committal. And it seemed like they were like, well, we're not familiar with this, national nonprofit that does this type of work. And as I understand, the New Bedford Police actually gave you all the records in order to conduct this study. So break that down for us a little bit here.
So I chuckled when that was played, because the mayor was invited to the report rollout and was informed of our website where the report was available, and elected not to show up or download the report and read it. So it's interesting that he says, I haven't seen it. That was a matter of choice. But yeah, so Citizens for Juvenile Justice, one of the major pillars of our work is research, engaging in research and the collection of data to not only understand how young people are interacting with different government systems, including police, but also breaking down and analyzing that data and then presenting it to the public, most importantly to communities, in a digestible way where people can really understand the interaction between young people in different local and state systems, but also utilize that in advocacy. So we send out public record requests to Boston and a number of other gateway cities, and New Bedford was one of those cities. We got the data, we did an analysis, as you saw from that video, we did a mapping, and it became very clear that in predominantly white areas of New Bedford, you saw virtually no stop and frisk or police level interactions, but in predominantly Black and brown communities, the color was completely dark. It was just, and ultimately, Black folks are 7% of the New Bedford population and make up 46% of all of those police incidents and encounters, which is just, it speaks for itself. The data speaks for itself. The numbers push for itself. And even as we're engaging in some back and forth, members of the community are saying this validates our experience. This validates what's happening. Also, jarring in the findings that I think I have to really mention here is the harmful impact of gang databases and just how overwhelmingly disproportionate. If you are a Black child, if you're a Black person in New Bedford, you are 27 times as likely to end up on a gang database than a white person. And it's problematic for a number of reasons. One, there's zero transparency. And this isn't a New Bedford issue. This is a Massachusetts issue as a whole. You're not told when you're placed on a gang database. There's no system of notification for it. And you have no ability to appeal your inclusion to get yourself off of it. Why is that damaging and harmful? If you come into contact with the system, even for a lower level offense, and evidence comes forth that you are in that gang database, it is going to lead to you having a harsher outcome, whether that's in a bail argument, whether that's in the disposition of a case. And as we saw in Boston with the young man from East Boston who went into the immigration system, deportation. So we have a system that is incredibly harsh and it has major impacts. There's no transparency on it, and it's overwhelmingly Black and brown. And so that was a major issue that we identified in the report as well in looking at racial disproportionality there.
And I think it's important to note, and if I read the graph and I looked at the data correctly, it's important to note that New Bedford has 4% Black people, but they made up, I believe, 46% of these arrests.
7% and then 46% of these interactions. And so, these interactions, they can be stops, they can be stop and frisk, they can be interrogations. Sometimes there's social media interactions, what it is. But the ultimate result of that, if you are of color, you are feeling like you are under constant surveillance, constantly being watched. Think about what that does to your mental health. Think about how that makes you feel when you can't walk to the corner store. You can't go to a playground and talk to your friends. It's summertime. You want to get out of the house and just take a walk. And there's always someone there watching you, stopping you, questioning you. Our Constitution has a protection against unreasonable searches and seizures because it recognizes that as citizens, we have a right to privacy. We want to be left alone, and especially when we aren't doing anything. But unfortunately, and we spoke to young people in the city, they never feel left alone. Two young men who were going to a program to attempt to get their high set talked about they left home and they walked, and a police car slowly rolled behind them and followed them all the way to the door of their program. Imagine how that makes you feel. You're trying to do the right thing, and yet you're constantly being watched by someone who says, you're so bad, I know you're going to do something wrong. I'm going to watch you every second. We have to do better by our young people in that.
Chynah, I want you to weigh in here. I'm sorry, Representative Tyler. I would love to have you weigh in here as the chair of the Black and Latino Caucus in Massachusetts, and working with the legislature in trying to prevent some of these experiences that Leon is talking about.
Absolutely. While Leon was giving his remarks, I thought about an incident that happened in the legislature this past session. We were taking up the issue topic of small stops. And I know, Leon, you remember this very well, where the issue topic was, are we going to collect data as to racial, demographic, age, race, all the identifying factors of any given individual when they're stopped by the police at the point of which they were issued a citation, or are we going to collect data just based off of the stop? Now, we know that if you're going to be harassed like Leon mentioned, you're probably not going to get a ticket. And so, so I really pushed. I had an amendment out there, and actually a bill, something I started years ago, to be able to make sure that upon stopping someone, it doesn't matter if you're going to issue them a ticket or not. We need to be sure that police officers are collecting data as to the racial demographic, age, gender, and what have you of individuals, because once we get that data back, we know folks are out there discriminating. That's going to deter them from doing so. And unfortunately, that was one of my biggest eye-opening moments in the legislature, and that I was the only person to vote no on that bill, because I was under the impression that we need to be making sure that we collect data at the point of any interaction when it comes to officers. Like, that is a pressure point for when it comes to people of color, and that didn't happen. And so very, very eye-opening that folks didn't feel the same way. And so moving forward, about a year later, not even a year, it wasn't even a year yet, it was about 6 to 9 months, was the awakening of the situation with the late Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And now all of a sudden we're doing a police reform bill. And so again, going back to your question before about how you feel, sometimes overlooking very, very heavy, where as a person of color, this is a lived experience for us every day. We're dealing with it every day. When I'm driving, sometimes I know I didn't run a red light and I see the blue lights behind me, my blood pressure is on 1,000, and I shouldn't have to feel that way. And so that's one of the things that was very, very eye-opening for me. But moving forward, I wanted to talk about where we should be going with that issue topic, in that we had the situation in New York where the gentleman was just in Central Park, just enjoying his day, the bird watching while black situation, and he was criminalized, and his identity was weaponized against him just for being in a park and just hanging out in a public park, and we can no longer tolerate that. And so this year, actually filed it last year with Senator Collins, and this year refiled it again to be able to address that issue where people that are not of color are using the 911 tool to be able to weaponize the color of someone's skin. And if you use the 911 tool incorrectly, you should be punished for that. There are so many different variables out there that allow for people of color to be weaponized, the color of our skin to be weaponized, and we need to be doing away with all those variables. And so one thing, again, that we noticed was police accountability, and that's how we came about with the post board, and to be able to make sure that we're holding officers accountable who don't equally apply the option of protecting and serving, which is at the center of their job.
I want to play just some reaction to the police reform bill, which was passed, I think, right before the first of the year. I remember we were watching it and hoping it would pass over last summer, and then right before the first of the year, we got it signed. So I want to play some reaction sound from that time. And, you're also going to hear sound from the Waltham police, a Waltham police officer, part of a police officers organizations that actually was invited to the White House when President Trump was occupying that space, and reacting to this as well as it was being written and legislated and voted through. So.
This is not a perfect bill. But for me, as a black man, as the father of 2 sons, friends of many other black men, neighbors, etc., I think it's a good first step towards having police understand the kind of accountability that the public wants.
Happy wouldn't be my word, because of the fact that simply it's just that realization that this comes on the back of people dying. I mean, literally, this is a fight that I've been fighting for 8 to 10 years because of the fact that we've had the unfortunate incidents happening between police and our community. And so, relieved that we've gotten it done.
And you have to keep people safe. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, it's just, the level of attacks that are going at us, going after our qualified immunity, going after our due process rights. It's a complete assault on the people who are paid to protect the citizens. And if we can't do our job, if in Massachusetts they want to file bills that we will not be able to put our hands on somebody unless we're arresting them. So if we're dealing with disorderly people, intoxicated people with mental health issues, trying to get them into an ambulance, get them to a hospital, we can be sued.
And you could be sued individually or as a force?
Individually.
So are they taking immunity away from you?
They're trying very hard.
This is not.
So what do we think about some of that sound there? you had Representative Russell Holmes who had worked on this on police reform for a long time. Eddie Crispin, obviously the Mamleo president there, and then some of these law enforcement officers from Massachusetts speaking with former President Trump about their concerns right before the bill was passed. So I'm interested to know, Representative Tyler, what you made of that.
Yeah, I kind of laugh a little bit because some of that commentary was unfortunate, and honestly disrespectful to the Black community. Being Black is not a choice. You're born this way. When it comes to actually becoming a police officer or being blue, as some people may quote it to be, that's a choice. That's a career. That's a profession. And at the point where you decide to be unprofessional with the choice that you're given to be able to protect and serve our community, yes, we need to be reforming our laws. And that's exactly what we did. So I'll keep my comments very short because that was very disappointing.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that accountability is not an attack. If you look at any other profession, I am an attorney. If I fail to carry out my job in a way that meets the code of ethics, or I don't do right by my client, I understand that failure brings a level of accountability to me. It is the same if you are a doctor, if you're the same if you are a nurse. There are people who have important jobs throughout society who understand that, yes, your job is important, and that's why you need to be accountable and held to a higher standard. And so this whole narrative of we're being attacked, when in reality, we're trying to bring the same level of accountability to the law enforcement profession that professions throughout society have. Yeah, it's just, it just makes you shake your head. I'll just leave it there.
I do want to ask you both, as you all obviously consume the news, you consume the media. What do you think of the media's job in covering this particular issue? I know news cycles are what they are, and they don't always serve us well because sometimes it's in the news every single day, and then you don't hear anything about it for weeks. But I'm interested in how you think the media did in explaining this to folks, meaning the police reform bill, in explaining its importance and, of course, its impact here in the Commonwealth.
I guess I'll start off by saying that's one of the reasons why I appreciate being on today's show and appreciate what you do, is because you provide a positive narrative, or the actual on-point narrative to what is actually happening. And oftentimes when it comes to Black folks and people of color in general, we're often fed false narratives when it comes to media. And so I actually take pride in that, because as an elected official, and also too as a leader, just a community leader in general, it is up to us to make sure that our community gets the correct information. And we've been working very, very hard to make sure that community is not only one understanding of the bill, but more importantly, is able to interpret it. So that way, should moving forward, if something change and they're faced with a situation where they have to interact with an officer, they know the law and that they're able to properly respond.
No, absolutely. As an organization that works, again, in coalition, but also does a great deal of community engagement, we've taken it upon ourselves to, even in the lead up to the bill, as amendments were being filed, we engaged folks and we took the time and we explained what actually was in the bill, what things would do and what they wouldn't do, to make sure the communities were informed, because it feels like sometimes the media gets caught up in superficial narratives. When you look at our national media and the debate format, where it's just people arguing back and forth, it ends up being this argument of opinions and not really getting into the details and the nuances of what policies will actually do. And that's where I think is a nonprofit organization like ours, we really take pride in, what does the research say? What does the data say? What do the actual provisions of the law currently say, and what will the changes do? Because we want to have informed communities, but also by informing communities, you hope that it encourages and mobilizes communities to call their elected officials and get involved and really make their voices heard. When you have a bill like police reform, you best believe that some of the folks in Blue Lives Matter will call repeatedly, as Rep. Tyler will tell you, but we need to match that energy from our communities in pushing for the reform and the forms and changes that we want.
Do you think, I think oftentimes in newsrooms, we struggle with giving folks the information, but making sure it's not too dense. And I think when we're talking about a bill or we're talking about data, then sometimes you're in that space and you're like, well, what do I give the community where they can digest it and understand? Do you think we're underestimating what people can manage when we're explaining something?
I would say absolutely not. Again, this is a lived experience, probably the majority of my district, if not all. And folks, if they're obviously everyone is concerned about police reform and concerned about interaction when it comes to authority. So that's like, non-negotiable, that issue topic. But when it comes to the specifics of the police reform bill, everybody has their own lived experiences. And so you want to be able to allow for someone to let you know what they're most concerned about and then explain, how things were in the past and how they will change. And then hopefully that'll open up the door for them to be able to ask more questions. And then the conversation is a little bit more fluid after that. You definitely can't underestimate, because these are the people who are living these experiences every day. And I definitely never underestimate my community. They're the reason why I'm here. More importantly, they help build a platform that I currently stand on and continue to fight for me just as much as I'm fighting for them. So definitely never underestimate.
Agree completely. And sharing data is validating. I mean, so if we step back, this has been happening to Black people for generations, these negative, harsh, and brutal interactions with police. And Black people have been speaking out about them. We have been marching and we've been protesting. This has been going on for generations. And for generations, it's been brushed aside. It's been ignored. It's been, well, those folks must have been resisting arrest or something else must have been there. Now we have it on video. Now it's clear. And in so many ways, but you still have that history of Black voices not being validated about the harms being committed against them. So I know, like earlier this week when we presented our report, as we're presenting, I'm looking at faces that are in the room on Zoom, and they're nodding and they're saying, thank you. We've been saying this forever, but thank you, because it's affirming and validating when people are presenting hard facts to back up what has happened to you and your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. So it is underestimating, but I think it's also underestimating the good that it does when you have a community that has experienced ongoing harm, to just present information which says, yes, we believe you. We see the evidence of that harm, and here it is. And that's one reason why we're so invested in sharing data with communities, because we've heard that feedback of how affirming it is.
Do you think that Massachusetts has a transparency problem when we're talking about law enforcement? And what I mean by that is, we, of course, know what happened on BPD, and that case is being investigated. Do we think that transparency is a number one issue here?
Big time. Big time. It really is. And what I would say is, we have a transparency issue throughout our entire juvenile and criminal justice system, especially as it relates to data on racial and ethnic disparities and the racial and ethnic impact of how the entire system works. I mean, for 16 years, and we've collaborated with Rep. Tyler on this, we've been pushing for a bill to bring greater transparency as far as data at every decision point in the court process. And you wouldn't believe the level of pushback we get from the system to that. I mean, the reality is, looking at this through a youth lens, for young people under 18, we have the worst racial disparity in youth incarceration for Latinx young people, and the 10th highest racial disparity in youth incarceration for Black kids. Black kids are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than white kids. Latinx kids 6.5. But despite those disparities, which we had to look at data that was sent to the federal government to get that, we still don't have that readily available and in a public-facing format for communities to view. Is one reason why we recently weighed in with the Boston City Council, where we commended the Boston police and analyzed Boston for developing a front-facing database as a step, but we wanted to make sure that the data in it was accurate, because if I'm living in a community, I should have the right to open up my laptop, go somewhere and see how my community is being policed, exactly what type of interactions are having, because then that gives me information, but it also helps me say, well, you know what? I feel like the resources going to police are not being deployed properly because they're not meeting the needs of my community. Giving data allows people to be more informed, and it allows people to be able to better advocate on those issues.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I guess the short answer is definitely second to everything Leon said, and that lack of transparency actually happens on all different levels, and so that's why this conversation so heavy and difficult, and these new laws to be implemented, because it's at every level. Let's talk about at a higher level, at a more umbrella level, where you talk about leaders in higher spaces. Right now, we passed this bill, and all 360 plus ones of our cities and towns and municipalities are supposed to be able to create this board or this post board. And the mayor of Springfield literally had to get sued into doing that. So the pushback of doing that's definitely yes on the lack of transparency. And then even at a lower level of just actually collecting data that Leon mentioned, oftentimes data just isn't collected. And then when it's collected, you're looking for something very specific. You're just looking for raw data. And by the time you get that information back, once you request it, it takes forever. And two, it's been so aggregated that it doesn't necessarily paint a picture. So that lack of transparency is happening on all different levels. Until we create a continuum that will allow for us to see through that, we're still going to be on an uphill battle.
And it also speaks to the need to always follow up.
And I want to back up a little bit, because as we were talking about this year of racial reckoning, there has been some victories. There has been chokehold bans that have been put in place. There have been police accountability measures that have been put in place around the country, and here in Massachusetts in different places. But are laws enough? And if not, if the answer is no, what can what can someone do in order to aid you all in the work that you're doing, like an everyday person? Because I think a lot of folks see a bill passed or a law passed or something like that, and they don't know, well, okay, well, that's not the end of it. That there needs to be a level of civic engagement, and so I would love for you all to sort of speak to that.
Yeah, you know what? I was actually having a conversation with a friend yesterday about this very issue topic. And what comes to mind when you ask that question is leadership. There are very, very few people of color when it comes to leadership across every workforce, every company, anything you could think of. There's a very, very minimal amount of people of color. And what happens is that when that happens, when there are very few people of color, if any at all, then things just don't get done properly, because there's not that perspective of someone of color being brought to the table. And then for that reason, whatever issue topic or whatever thing is to be whatever task is at hand isn't done properly. And so I would definitely say making sure that there are more people of color in leadership positions so that we won't be where we are today. And I wanted us to actually go back to your last question. Leon kept alluding to, like, our ancestors and people before us for generations have been fighting for the very thing that we're fighting for today. We've already marched. People are tired of marching. They're at a point of, they're past marching, and I just wanted to draw attention to the timeline. In the 50s and 60s, things begin to change on paper when it comes to laws for people of color, specifically for Black folks. And we're literally in the same position that we are today. And that was only about 50 or 60 years ago. That's within my own mother's timeline, and so I just wanted to bring attention to it, that we're not very far from where we were 60 years ago when it comes to progress. And I really, really hope that there are more people of color that are promoted in leadership roles. And so you ask, what can the community do to be able to support this issue topic? And that is support your leaders of color, because oftentimes they're probably the only them in the space that they operate in. And it's very, very hard being a leader of color and being the only you, or being one of two or one of three or one of 200 or 5 of 200 in a space, because it makes your job very, very hard. But when you have your community and you have support and you have folks like Leon supporting, it makes the fight a little bit easier and a little bit realistic, I would say.
No, I agree completely. And that's your leaders of color at the local and the state level is so important to support them. So two responses. One, we have to realize that once the law is passed, that's only a step. And then we still have to pick up the ball and run from there to ensure that there's implementation. One thing we learned from the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act is that there were provisions that looked really good in the law, but they weren't implemented by law enforcement. One example is the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act required the collection of school-based arrest data to really measure not anecdotes and stories, but the actual impact of police officers in schools. And it tasked school districts and police come together, figure it out, report it to the Department of Education. When we joined with mental health legal advisors to follow up on that, we found that only 34 of 289 districts reported anything. And of those that reported, they were gateway cities where it took one phone call to an attorney or a public defender working in that jurisdiction to be like, are you kidding me? That's way lower. An example of how egregious it was, Springfield was just mentioned. Springfield reported 0 school-based arrests in the 2018-19 school year. We had submitted a public record request to them for that year, and we knew for a fact they had 41, including one high-profile incident that went viral. So it was just a complete and total refusal to engage in any level of transparency. So that's just an example of how we can't take our eye off the ball. When a law is passed, we have to continue to advocate to ensure that those laws are implemented. And I think a big part of that is for advocates at the local level to join with statewide organizations, for advocates at the, so for electeds at the local level to talk to at the state level and just make sure that there's the follow through so that these hard fought victories that go into state law actually get implemented at the local level, or that there's some level of accountability when they're not.
And can I follow up on that? Because, joining local groups is very, very important. Oftentimes you may have a group that is fighting for an issue topic that may affect the everyday life of people of color, but not one person of color on the board or not one person of color on the organization. And so when we're creating these bills and we're relying on what have you advocacy group to help, bring forth information, it's misguided because they're not people of color that are, involved in that topic. So that's one I would definitely say, and that's a leadership conversation, making sure that people that are, experiencing this every day are the people that are actually working on, whatever's to be brought about. And then secondly, when it comes to implementation, and I laugh as a state rep, and I definitely want to give kudos to all 159 state reps and senators in the legislature, and that a lot of the times when we create a bill and it's passed, the implementation oftentimes is not exactly what we intended it to be. But how you can combat that is, again, making sure that you're a part of organizations like CFJJ and increasing their power so that they can go and make sure that they're working with the departments alongside us to be able to make sure that the intention is implemented correctly.
I'm also thoughtful about, as we move forward in the conversation about defunding the police, which is a hot button topic. And I think the narrative around what that looks like, what defund is supposed to be. And I think when people hear it, they think of just taking money away from a police department. And then there's a conversation around public safety. I have many folks who work in the education space, and they joke to themselves and say, well, they've been defunding education for many, many, many years. And so there isn't the same sort of urgency or anger that specific phrase elicits. And Leon, you mentioned young folks as well, which is so important to this conversation. So let's talk about reimagining what a police department looks like, or what law enforcement looks like in Massachusetts. What are some of the fundamental changes that need to happen now that we know more? So now that we know better, how do we do better from here on out?
So I think, for one, reimagining public safety is understanding that, public safety is not a one size fits all. Police are not the only solution, and that there are certain issues you simply cannot arrest your way out of. You cannot arrest your way out of an addiction crisis. You cannot arrest your way out of mental health. You need supports and services that go to those underlying issues Otherwise, you're going to have a cycle of recidivism that's never ending. And when you have people continually recidivating, that does not make the community safer, because people aren't getting underneath those issues and getting better and stopping the behavior that we want to stop. So I think it's really about divesting some of the money that's gone towards law enforcement to try to address issues that really would be better handled through other means, like mental health and substance abuse. So you look in the school circumstance, you have a student who's gone through trauma, who has emotional issues which impact their learning. They have an individualized education plan, and they're going through a lot, and they're having a bad day. And yes, they're being disruptive. Who should respond to that? Should it be a uniformed police officer who may be well-intended and want to be a mentor for kids, but he does not have the education or the training of a mental health professional or a counselor? Or should you be funding an actual school psychologist or an actual counselor who understands through their education and training how to de-escalate, redirect, and get that student what they need? Again, it's not an attack on police. It's saying, like, if you're a handyman, you need a whole toolbox of tools to do your job. You can't just walk around with a hammer and say, I'm gonna fix every single thing that's wrong. We need to have a public safety toolbox with varied tools to meet people where they are and actually address the underlying cause of the issues that we're having. And that's what I use: divest and reinvest. We divest from some funds, but we reinvest it in supports and services that actually help people who are struggling get better, because once they better, they no longer reoffend, and that's what gets you safer communities.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right on that. Like, reallocations of funds is the answer. I wouldn't necessarily say defund, because when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we also have Black police officers. So do you really want to take away their ability to be able to create generational wealth within their families? Probably not. So reallocation is definitely the way to go. I also wanted to comment too on something that you just mentioned was around responding and properly responding instead of the proper response when people are actually going through things. Policing isn't always the proper response. And actually, just 2 days ago, actually, in partnership with the city of Boston, we filed an amendment to the budget. So we're undergoing the budget cycle right now, and we filed a $2 million amendment for the city of Boston to be able to allow for more proper support to be able to assist police officers while policing. Again, a police officer oftentimes may not be the best person to respond to a mental health issue. We have a young gentleman, rest in peace, Terrence Coleman, from here in Boston in the South End, who his parents called to be able to allow for him to receive mental health and wellness support. Something was going on within their personal life and their household. And at the end of the situation, he ended up, his life was taken, unfortunately. And I feel like that issue probably could have been addressed a little bit better. So definitely reallocating funds. Another thing that I'd like to mention also too is making sure that when we reallocate those funds, reallocate them to making sure that we're allocating them to departments that make sense. And so I know the city of Boston has one of the very, very few bureaus of community engagement that is led by Officer Baston, who does an amazing job in having a positive, making sure that our youth have a positive interaction when it comes to authorities, so that in the future, they're not going to give Officer Boston a hard time or vice versa. Or she won't give them a hard time when something real is happening once they become an adult. And so again, definitely reallocation of funds. And we hope that we make sure that protecting and serve applies equitably to everyone, particularly people of color, Black people in Boston.
And Leon, I want to ask you, because I had a conversation with some young folks recently. I was speaking to a class in Boston, and it's always interesting to me because young folks will watch the events of unfolding, the 13-year-old who was killed recently, the events that are happening in Minnesota. And their lens is they take that as either something that doesn't affect them or something that could happen to them literally tomorrow. I think a lot of folks feel like that way, but for me, it's particularly touching when a young person says, when I walk to school tomorrow, that could happen to me. They automatically feel that and connect that. And so My question to you is, since you work in the juvenile justice space, how do we speak to young people in a way where, one, they don't internalize that trauma as their own, and then maybe act out because they're trying to process what those feelings look like, and how can the system serve them better in working through this? And I guess this is something for both of you all, because I think you both engage young people on this.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there are certainly layers to it. Um, you know, so you ask, how do we talk to? The first thing we have to do is listen. We have to give them a safe space to be able to talk and express and unpack all of those emotions. I also think it helps to have people who are older who can truly relate to them. If they say, I see that and it can happen to me, I can say I'm 47 years old, and when a police car pulls behind me, my heart begins racing to this day because of things that happened when I was a young person. And when, when you're feeling something and you feel like there's no one to listen to and you feel all alone, it really blows up. But when you're able to talk, when you're able to unpack, when you're able to talk to other people of different ages and backgrounds who relate, that's certainly helpful. At the same time, we have to change our system to make sure there are more people embedded in their schools and in their communities who are able to address those needs through a trauma-informed lens, which is where reinvesting resources comes into play. The American School Counselors Association says there should be a 250-to-1 ratio of students to counselors. Despite being one of the wealthiest states, Massachusetts doesn't come close. We're at 397-to-1 across the Commonwealth. And you can imagine some of the wealthier towns are much under that. So you can imagine in some of our urban areas how much over they are. That shouldn't be the case in a state this wealthy. We need more counselors. We need more psychologists. We need more mental health professionals, not only in our schools, but in our community centers, who, when young people are going through it, they have someone. Think about what happens in the suburbs if there's a tragedy, if there's a student who unfortunately commits suicide or something happens. Grief counselors are on site immediately. But in our community, young people are coming with pins of loved ones on their jackets, and they don't have anyone to talk to. That's not okay. We have to reimagine our system, whether you're living in Dorchester or you're living in Wellesley, you should have that same level of support. And that's what we have to aspire towards.
Yeah, I mean, you're right on point with that. I would definitely say too, to add to that is making sure that they have, and just listening to our youth, is to make sure that they have the facts as to help to kind of create the direction in which they're going. Not very many of our youth have that information, and that's simply all embedded within our education system. We just had to do a huge education reform, talking about reforms, education reform bill, because our students of color, particularly Black and Latino students, have a huge academic achievement gap where they're at the lower threshold of that spectrum. And the problem is that our youth just don't have the information that they need to be able to, one, get active in their community, and two, to be competitive upon 12th grade. And so, one, making sure that, for example, when it comes to police reform, that they are aware that the foundation of the police officers in general, or that Boston Police Department was one of the first police departments, and the goal of it wasn't to be able to protect folks that look like us on this panel. So once they have that information, their lens is adjusted a little bit more correctly as to where they should be going, should they want to get active in this situation. And then moving forward, making sure that we provide access to opportunity for them to be able to combat this issue in the way that they see fit. Not all of our youth are aware of the pathways and opportunities that are available to them when it comes to addressing the issue. They may want to work in higher education. They may want to become a police officer. They may want to become a firefighter. They may want to actually be on the front lines and be an activist and become the next executive director or the next state rep here for the 17th district. But if they cannot see that, if they are not aware of how to get to that position, then they're automatically going to be at a standstill and be kind of caught up in that recidivism cycle. And so we hope to be able to make sure that we're creating as many pathways. I call them pathways out of poverty because it's a poverty mindset, as many pathways out of poverty for our youth as possible so that they can be solutions to the problem. They're so innovative. They're so smart. They have so many creative ideas. I'm a mom. My daughter's 10 years old. And sometimes when I'm thinking too hard about things, she just says it so simply. And I'm just like, you know what? You're right. But giving them that opportunity is very, very important.
Which is why I say opportunity gap and not achievement gap.
Give folks the marching orders. I want, what's the call to action here? Especially knowing what you all know and sitting in the spaces that you sit on. We want folks to be empowered to work in their community and be empowered to change the things that they see around them, that they see that is an issue. So what's the call to action?
I guess I'll start off ruffling some feathers on this great Sunday afternoon. When it comes to a call to action, Massachusetts is often known as a progressive state, and I'm going to put that in air quotes because it's progressive for some and not for all. And folks that are the some folks are the folks that look like the people that are on this panel today. And so my call to action is making sure that when we're talking about what progress looks like in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, particularly for people of color, we're challenging that and making sure that it's progress for us as well, because oftentimes when we're creating policy and creating initiatives or just putting things forth, it's not actually the same amount of progress for people of color as it is for everyone else. So the call to action is making sure that you define progress in your own way.
I second that completely. And again, that's why data is so important, because when you look at the data and you look at the numbers, you will see that our outcomes for Black and Brown people, for Black and Brown young people, are so much worse than some of those red states that we like to reference when trying to say that we are progressive. But I would just add it in the call to action that the battle continues, the drive for accountability continues. So, the current legislative session has started, and there are bills that are addressing the presence of police in schools. There are bills that are continuing to fight to broaden expungement. Expungement being so important because when young people are constantly being stopped and harassed by law enforcement, they're more likely to get arrested. This means they're more likely to get these records, which having negative impact on them later in life. So we're continuing to push. Expungement was in this bill. It was a slight step. We're not good enough. We're looking to expand it more with more young people who've aged out of certain behavior and they put it behind them. They should be able to clear their record and put it all the way behind them. So what I would say is, organizations like ours who are engaged in advocacy on the systemic level, or your local state rep, like Rep Tyler, reach out, find out what bills are out there to benefit the community. And we really need to begin connecting on not just implementing the bill that we just had, but continuing to move reform forward, because we're far from being done.
Representative Chynah Tyler is the chair of the Black and Latino Caucus in the Massachusetts legislature, and Leon Smith is the executive director of the Citizens for Juvenile Justice. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
And I want to remind you all that Common Narrative is every Sunday right here on Spark FM Online, also on our Facebook, Common Narrative Media, and you can find us on your Apple Podcasts and on Spotify as well. You can also watch a replay of this on our YouTube channel, Common Narrative Media, as well. I'm Crystal Haynes. Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon. And remember, knowledge is power, and power is change. We'll see you next time.